an invitation to participate in an interactive map project when this speaker is over. This is really a chance for you all to think about how you connect with the land and that's important to you and the land you maybe haven't thought about before, and just rethink your relationship with that. So that's out just outside, is that right? Is that right? Just outside this? Very cool. So our next speaker today is Forrest Cooch. He's a Ute. He's a member of the Ute Indian tribe and was born and raised in the Uinta and Ouray Ute Indian Reservation in northeastern Utah. He has a BA in the Behavioral Sciences from Westminster College, and he has held many challenging jobs during his 38-year career. Hello? Is this good? Just keep talking. Well, you don't have to hear me. I just want to make sure it's good to go for Forrest. He's held many challenging jobs during his 38-year career, having worked for several Indian tribes in various capacities, to serving as director for Utah Division of Indian Affairs. Currently, he's retired and has been providing lectures on healing trauma, Native American history, and conservation. We're really excited to have him here today, and he will be sharing his talk on the Doctrine of Discovery impact on the Utes. Can we get a round of applause for Forrest?
Good morning, everyone. Nice to be back in the valley. Of course, without all the clutter and all of the craziness out there. I'm a nature lover. How many of you know this is the homelands of the Ute Indian people? How many? Raise your hands. That's encouraging. How many of you have heard of the Doctrine of Discovery? Just a few of you. Well, this is going to be a good lesson then. Okay, well, let's begin. Most of you probably know this. I hope you do. Before Columbus, the area known now as the United States was populated by indigenous people of many nations, tribes, with their own languages, social customs, and spiritual expressions. Many scholars currently believe the indigenous population of the Western Hemisphere neared 100 million, okay? Mostly in South America. Probably 60 million in South America. The U.S. indigenous population around the time of Columbus is estimated to have been between 1 and actually Dobbins said between 1 and 18 million, but I kind of stick with 10 million. I think there's more evidence to suggest it was probably somewhere between 1 and 10 million in the continental United States. Here's the real tragedy, though. By the census taken in 1890, there were only 249,000 American Indians available. That's 250,000. So even if you take a reduction, if you take 1 million Native people, it was reduced to less than 250,000 people at that time, mostly due to disease. But there was certainly warfare also, okay? It's important to point that out from the beginning. This is just kind of an old romantic reflection of the conquest, the beginning of the conquest. Now, there are different methods of enacting genocide with the object of making people Did I lose it? No, okay. The Doctrine of Discovery was one of them. Intentional and systematically implemented from 1492 to 1890, perpetuated by initial European invaders in North America, and continued by the U.S. government and churches through assimilation processes, namely boarding schools, which is the second method. Now, there were three papal decrees that I know of. Okay, but this is the most important one. Inter Cetera, 1493. Notice it's 1 year after Columbus arrived here. But during that time, that was the period of discovery, right? These explorers, initially from Portugal and other points in the area, were going out and discovering new lands. And the problem was that these lands were occupied by indigenous people. And so the idea was brought back to the Pope, we have to do something about these people. What do we do if you have people living on these lands? So apparently there was quite some discussion about this, and the decision was for the Pope to issue a decree, a doctrine, a statement of law. And this was Pope Alexander VI who issued this papal decree, Inter Cetera, in which he authorizes Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas and its native people as discovered subjects. This was the first use of the term. Okay? That's a visual of the decree. I always ask this question, okay? Now this was taken from an old classic book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Any of you hear that? That's an old classic. Well, if you read the book, you know that he refers to Columbus's journal, right? And according to Columbus, the Taino Indians were kind and generous. They were childlike. Colom referred to them as Indio, or in Dios, in God. Colom, on the other hand, arrived with soldiers, battle-ready with swords and shields. Colom and the soldiers represented Christianity. The Taino, sometimes referred to as Arawak, represented non-Christian heathens, the uncivilized. But I always say a critical judgment was made at that time. A very, very critical judgment. And of course it was reflected in the doctrine, in the papal decree, and it was that indigenous are not human beings. Because they are not Christian, they are not human, okay? But yet, the Taino, if you look at this description, they were more Christ-like. They came out into the water naked except for breechcloths, bearing gifts, welcoming Colom. Who were the heathens? Who were the savages? That's my question to this day. The doctrine of discovery, in many ways, is alive and well today. Okay? Now, here's the thing. I wrote a paper back in 1986, and I thought it would get more reviews back east, so I published through the it was the University of Massachusetts Education and Equity Journal. I really should have done the one that would serve the Southwest. But anyway, I pointed out the differences in the value systems and the worldview of the Europeans and the Indians. And I was basing this basically on observations of my own people, the Ute Indian people. And what I found is, of course, the European people were capitalists and valued personal gain to this day, where indigenous people were mostly, not all, but most were socialists, and sharing and generosity were highly valued. In fact, among our people, it's the one who gives away the most who is considered the wealthiest, okay? So you see, we're starting to see a different world here. See the world completely different, okay? Consumption hoarding versus use, consumption and hoarding of goods versus use what is needed, okay? To this day, that's a practice among our people. Sure, there's a few folks that get greedy once in a while, but most of the time our people follow that belief system, that idiom that you only use what is needed. Hierarchy versus egalitarian. Now this is evidenced by the fact that Indian tribes in general have a terrible time managing goods and resources, especially people. When you come to that, putting one Indian in charge of another Indian, it's always a struggle. I always wondered why, and then I figured it out. I need to give credit to someone, University of Colorado, he's the one who brought out a lot of this, and he discovered this through brain dominance theory, left-right brain. Anyway, the native people were very much egalitarian. In fact, they did not really have permanent leaders all the time. That became the situation in dealing with the U.S. military or the cavalry and the U.S. government. What used to happen is we would have situational leadership. If we were going hunting buffalo, we would follow a hunt chief who was experienced and knowledgeable in that area. If it was war, the most experienced warrior would lead, whatever the situation was. But we get back to camp, and those guys, they submerged back into their place. And there was probably a camp chief or even a woman in most cases. Because, it's a little further down, but we were a matriarchal society, okay? Whereas the dominant world were patriarchal. The men made all the rules, still to this day. Accumulation of wealth is highly valued among the Europeans. Generosity, I mentioned earlier, is the most highly valued concept among the Indian people. Competitive. Europeans were competitive. Native people, yeah, to some extent, but mainly it was competition with the self to try to do better. In fact, teachers have always said, how come Indian kids don't raise their hands when they know the questions a lot of times in class? Well, they're not really competitive. They have to kind of be taught that, okay? We're learning to be competitive now, for better or worse. Analytical, linear. How come Indian kids struggle so much in school? Well, it's because they view the world differently, okay? When it comes to linear learning, sequential, 1, 2, 3, and Indian kids, they see the whole, okay? And how does it feel? Operate from the heart more than the head, okay? So if you're going to educate Indian kids, you got to figure out a new system. Well, we were never important enough for folks to do that. Scientific, spiritual. The European utilized the scientific approach, and then people explained the world in spiritual terms. I like to think nowadays I like to think that in many ways the dominant world sees the world and explains the world in terms of physical properties. The Indian people explain the world at a quantum level. Okay? I've come to really appreciate that. The quantum world, there are no rules. Of course, Einstein was arguing with another scientist over that years ago. I I don't know if it was ever resolved. Patriarchal versus matriarchal to this day. Okay? In our culture, the Ute Indian people, women owned the property rights. Women had control of the property rights. Okay? So guys could go fool around, but they would soon discover all of their property was no longer theirs. Okay? Women, they didn't always take charge, but when there was something important to them, they would let it be known. Even in the council chambers, mostly men, if the women said, "We don't like that," the old grandmas would come in there and demand attention, and they would get it, and they would say, "We don't like this. Stop this right now." And most of the time, they would get their way. Okay? Dominion over nature versus dominion over nature, one with nature. Really important here to your symposium theme. Okay? I can't say enough about that. I mean, it used to be viewed as a romantic notion. Oh, Indians, one with nature. It's much more deeper than that. Okay? It has to do with connection with, first of all, your spirit. Okay? And then you connect with nature, with Creator. It's a very deep concept. And when you break that connection, that's when confusion can evolve. And could spend all day talking about that one. But anyway, I just wanted to get across to you that the indigenous people viewed the world differently. In many ways, they came from a different world. Okay? And they were never appreciated for it, because their way of life was viewed as good for nothing, had nothing to offer. Well, my friends, here and now, those values have something to offer. Those values can get us out of the hell we're in right now. Okay? So, now in 1492, children were taught to memorize this year with pride and joy as the year began living full and imaginative lives on the continental North America. But people had been living full and imaginative lives on the continent for hundreds, more like thousands of years before Columbus and then sea pirates began to rob, cheat, and kill them. Shoshone lore. The Ute people are part of the Shoshone Nation. Okay. The Ute Indian people are a part of the Shoshone Nation. Shoshone Nation includes the eastern and western Shoshone, the Bannock, the Goshute, the Paiute, and even the Comanche people. We were the largest tribe in the western United States at one time, the most powerful. And then we began breaking out, branching out in different parts of the West. I could talk all day about that, but our lore says that we've been here 20,000 years. There's even some DNA to back it up. So anyway, been here a long time. A long, long time. Now, most of you are probably familiar with this concept, right? It's what drove this country to be what it is, and it had good news and bad news. It was a phrase coined by the New York newspaper editor John O'Sullivan, and it's what drove the territorial expansion of the 19th century. And it was a belief that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread its democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. I've asked our elders about this. I said, why did this terrible thing happen to our people? Why did we lose all of our land? And not all of them, but most of them say, well, we don't know all things. We don't know that this was not supposed to happen. Stay open, stay strong, and be a Utes, be a Ute. That's what they told me. Now, the second method I referred to earlier to kill and make people disappear is to take their culture away. And this policy, kill the Indian, save the man, was actually a U.S. government policy. And it was instituted by this general, Richard Henry Pratt, who established the federal Indian school system, beginning with Carlisle Indian School. And he is credited with the above quote. Now, Carlisle is a famous school in Pennsylvania. Jim Thorpe attended that school, and numerous other Indian athletes, and they were professional football evolved out of the football program at that school, and Jim Thorpe was a big part of that. And this gives you a glimpse of what it looked like. And this is a transformation here of when the Lakota kids arrived at school, and this is what they looked like after they got civilized and dealt with. And sometimes this is what happened to a large degree. We repatriated one of our youth from Carlisle 2 years ago. Okay, we returned her to our reservation, and she died at Carlisle. Now I want to turn to what you're all talking about today. I gave this talk up in South Dakota 2 weeks ago. I talked about the earth, sovereignty, stewardship. And one of the things I always say is, we did not create the earth. Therefore, we have no right to destroy it, okay? Now, I've heard some people in this valley believe we're going to get a new earth based on their gospel principles, and I think that's nonsense. I think that is total nonsense, and I'll tell you right now, this earth is all that matters right now. And it's sacred. It's a part of us. And we better learn to take care of it, okay? That's what that's all about. It's been said we're living, this is a near-death experience. This fellow came back with this quote. We're living in the days of Noah, when mankind has but two priorities, wealth and pleasure. Now you look around right now in the news, the national news, and what you read online about what's happening in this country. Is this not what's happening? We're all about wealth and pleasure. That's all that really matters these days. Well, one of my favorite spiritual leaders, medicine men, his name was John Lame Deer. There was a book written back in the 60s, Lame Deer, Seeker of Visions. And he said back then, if the earth should ever be destroyed, it will be by desire, by lust of pleasure and self-gratification, by greed for the frog skin. He always referred to money as frog skins. By people who are mindful only of their own self, forgetting about the wants of others. Now, he said that back in the 60s, okay? Well, it's 50 years later, and all of this stuff is starting to happen. Now, we're living in a world that's out of balance, okay? Some people have plenty, but most have too little. Those with the greatest power and influence seem to have lost touch with the Creator and lost respect for creation. For us to survive, a time of cleansing and renewal is urgently needed. Are mainstream Americans willing to make these changes, needed changes? Is spiritual and economic transformation possible in today's polarized society? That's a question we all have to ask ourselves, okay? And it's a tough one, okay? Remember, the native way of giving was to give and only take what was needed, but to always give thanks for every little thing you received in life. That was something they taught you when you were a baby, these old grandmas. That's what these grandmas would teach us. The Ute Indians, they were the stewards of central Utah back then. And I'll give some examples of that. This is the entire Ute Nation. It covered both Utah and Colorado. There were 12 bands originally, and now there's only 6, 3 on my reservation and 3 in southern Colorado. You all know about Dominguez and Escalante's arriving in this area in 1776 at the time of the American Declaration of Independence. Well, this is the Ute lands in Utah. The original homelands was all points south and east of central Utah, Utah Valley, Sanpete Valley, Uinta Valley, Moab, surrounding areas. Utah Valley was the home of the Timpanowats and the Timpanogos bands. Sanpete Valley was the home of the Sanpete, Pavant, and Chibadich bands. This band included members of the White River Band of Northwest Colorado, my father's band. The Uinta Valley were occupied by a small band called Uinta-Ats. Okay? But that's an idea of where the Ute Indians roamed. There was a band called Kamumba that occupied the Weber River and Colville Valley areas, most likely a combination group of Ute and Shoshone. One of their leaders was named Wanship. Wanship was a Ute who spoke Shoshone as well as Ute. And the languages are similar, but they've changed over time due to separation. An interesting note is that the Utes can understand the Comanches better than they can the Shoshone as a result of contact with them. And, of course, war. They became mortal enemies, and that's a story in itself. As you know, settlers arrived in 1847, and imagine this beautiful valley before the development occurred. The discovery and history began in Utah at that time with the Roman Catholic priests, Dominguez and Escalante. Now, contrary to popular belief, the Ute of Utah Valley lived very well, with 30% of their diet consisting of fish, Bonneville cutthroat trout, and other species from Utah Lake. I've read accounts. A lot of this comes from a book called On Zion's Mount by Jared Farmer. How many of you have read or heard of that book? Those of you who have not read that book and are interested in the environmental aspects of this valley, read that book, Jared Farmer, On Zion's Mount. He gave descriptions of the lower Provo River. It was black with fish. Bonneville cutthroat trout, there were so many at times. The river was black. You could go in and scoop them out with your hands. and they were as big as salmon, okay? Some of them averaged around 5 pounds at times. This fishery was incredible. I don't know if I have it noted in the PowerPoint, but Utah, according to Jared, Utah Lake was one of 3 most productive inland freshwater fisheries in the western United States. The other one was Pyramid Lake, and I think the other one was Tahoe, I'm not sure. But very rich and productive with resources. I already mentioned we're a branch of the Shoshone Nation. Now, the Ute people only became destitute after they were displaced. That's when they became starving and destitute. But before that time, they lived well. 30% of their diet, fish, supplemented by deer, elk, antelope, wild vegetables, wild fruit, seeds. This was a lush paradise, okay? The Utes had to fight off enemies all the time who wanted to take over this area. Okay, I mentioned this already. Now, there's some evidence to indicate the Utes managed not only Utah Lake, but Fish Lake and Lake Sevier, counting the spawns, determining the harvest potential, and limiting the harvest, and some other things. Initially, the Utes allowed Mormon settlers to fish in the lake, but within a short period, they began using fish nets and were taking wagon loads of fish to Salt Lake City. It fed the city for about 10 years. We're talking wagon loads, okay? And so it didn't take long before the fish were depleted and the lake became polluted from human livestock waste and agricultural contaminants. The decline began within a few years after the settlers arrived, okay? And that was kind of what led up to a lot of the confrontations that would take place. Now, I want to bring this out. This is painful to some of you, but I was raised with this curse belief. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have a peculiar belief that people of color have been cursed. This belief is referenced in the Book of Mormon, Nephi 2, which contends that American Indians are descendants of the Hebrew people. Regardless of any connection with Mormon faith, Indians have suffered systematic racism and dehumanization under this designation. Now, I know that the book has been revised to refer to spirit, a darkened spirit, rather than the color of the person's skin. Problem is the damage has been done. A lot of us were raised under that assumption that something was wrong with us, that we've been cursed. And I don't believe God curses anybody. And Simon Southerton did some research on this. And there's no native DNA in the Hebrew people. There's no relationship whatsoever. So I just want to share that with you, that was an example of the dehumanization that continued to exist in this area and has done a lot of harm. Okay? Now, my people, they were slow to acquire the horse from their cousins in Colorado, and according to Jared, it's because they had fish. Fish was their primary diet. So they started to acquire the horse from their visits from their cousins. And these were bands of the Southern Ute, those bands that I referred to earlier, and they acquired them from the Spanish from confrontations very early. There's numerous accounts in Shoshone lore. One says there was a conflict on the Arkansas River, and And the Utes watched how the horse was used and some of them, they started rounding up the strays. One story says that some of our Utes were captured and placed in prison, and that's where they, or jail, or locked up, and that's where they witnessed the use of the horse. They planned an escape on horseback, and they pulled it off. They pulled it off and began rounding up other horses. And the horse transformed the Ute culture. We became a mountain plains tribe. Now there's a book coming out this coming year. It's called Wakara Remains. The author's name is Max Mueller. Now this book is going to be pretty controversial, but it brings forth a lot of the things we're learning about the Ute people. But in the course of researching that book, Max came and picked me up, and we came down to the Provo Paleontology Center, and we went in and witnessed a horse skeleton that was discovered here in Lehigh, okay, a few years ago. And the significance of that skeleton is that it did not have any Spanish DNA. It was not related to the Spanish horses, the Spanish breeds that were brought here. One theory is it might have been brought here by the French trappers. We don't know, but it was carbon dated, if I recall correctly, between the period of 1670 and 1750 or 60. So there was a range in there where this horse was in existence here before the horse was ever thought to be in this area. And they examined the vertebrae and determined it had been ridden, and it was 28 years old, old horse. It had been well cared for, and it had been ridden bareback, not with a saddle. Okay, so Lehigh horse kind of threw a wrench in the whole idea of when horses arrived here. There's a thesis written by a woman to suggest they've always been here, and it was accepted. So there's some evidence to indicate that, but the jury's still out about that. Now, 3 years after the settlers arrived, the first major conflict evolved. Now, I say most of it had to do with resources, okay? The settlers came in, their livestock were grazing and displacing wild game that the Ute depended upon for food. Jared gives an account where one of the chiefs said, before a major winter occurred here, there used to be buffalo and large amounts of deer and elk in this valley. And ever since that winter, there was a decline in it. And then when the settlers brought their domestic livestock, it was pushing the wild game further and further. So the Utes had to go out further to acquire game. And then as they began fishing the river, there was a decline in the amount of fish. And so the Ute people's thinking was, well, I'm sure they will understand if I shoot a cow, because my family's starving. They'll understand that I need the cow, and I'm going to share it with all the others, because I'm having to go so far for wild game. No, that Indian got shot. He got shot. Different worldview, okay? So when the settlers began using nets and shipping fish to Salt Lake, that was another traumatic event. There was an old Indian, his name was Old Bishop, and he was caught stealing a shirt off the line. But he also was caught there was 3 settlers hunting deer on the Provo River in violation of a no-hunt treaty negotiated with Brigham Young. Well, Old Bishop was killed, filled with rocks, and thrown in the river. So there's one version that, hey, this guy stole a shirt. The other one is he caught people poaching on the Provo River in violation of a no hunting treaty. Now, this Black Hawk War took place a little later. The significance of this war is that it was far more costly financially and in lives than originally believed. Mormon settlers were pushed out of 4 counties and over 70 settlements. Over 70 Utes and about 15 settlers lost their lives. Recent research conducted by Philip Godfredson, he's the grandson of the Godfredson, I forget his first name now, that wrote Indian Depredations, published in 1917. So this is his grandson. He interviewed Mormon descendants, mostly of central Utah, and this information indicates that Utah Territory spent about $1.5 million on the war, equivalent to about $28 million in 2018. The significance also is it resulted in the removal of the Utes from Utah Valley to the Uinta Valley, where I live to this day. So Black Hawk War, there's a whole story behind that. Black Hawk witnessed his family being exterminated by Mormon settlers. And he had a sense of wanting to get back at the settlers for that. At the same time, though, he was being educated in schools. So he was becoming familiar with Mormon people in this area. And that kind of explains that when this war was over, Black Hawk was wounded in the belly. One version is that he was taunting the Mormon militia. The other one is that one of his warriors was wounded, so he took his horse out and held the horse in front of him and then retrieved the warrior and then came back, but one of the officers shot the horse. The bullet went through the horse and got him in the stomach, not deep enough to kill him, but enough to cause an infection. And so that's what led to him dying about a year later. And so he finally went back to the reservation where I live now. He cut his hair, but then he did a peculiar thing. He asked his warriors to bring him back here to the valley, and including Sanpete County, all the places, Gunnison, all the places he raided. And he went to towns, and he did 2 things. He explained why he led those attacks, those raids, and he said, I'm sorry. He apologized. Why? Because he knew some of the people here. He knew them, and it hurt him that some of them were killed, okay? And not every town accepted his apology. Some people would run him off and say, get out of here, no part of you. But some did. Some people welcomed them and gave them, they gave them a voice, okay? So Black Hawk is really, he's very, among his own people, the Utes, some of them thought he was a sellout for going back and apologizing. Okay, and some said no, he was a great leader. He did what he had to do. He was probably one of the most experienced. He was more of a war general than Wakara. And so, and some of the people in central Utah, they were the ones that gave this information to Godfredson. They had a greater appreciation for Black Hawk than most. So it's kind of an interesting story there. Now, this is a a visual of the state of Utah. And you can see in the corner, northeast corner, there's an outline, and then there's a darkened area. Okay, the outline is the reservation boundary, and then the darkened area is the land that currently exists under trust. So the original Uinta Valley Reservation was established by executive order of Abraham Lincoln, 1860. And I've seen different figures for this. The acreage I've seen was 2.2, and another one is 2.8. So usually I say 2.5. Then in 1880, the Ouray Reservation, which was about 2 million acres, was established for the Utes who were removed from Colorado and displaced to Utah. Those were my father's people. The Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 resulted in the loss of thousands of acres that were assigned to homes, to head of households, and a lot of them sold that land. Soon after, land and mineral speculators and others began entering the reservation against the law. In 1905, at the request of Utah citizens, Congress authorized the Homestead Act, which opened up the reservation to settlers. 2 national forests were established. At the end of this period, only 500,000 acres, or 20% of the original land base, remained as Ute trust lands. Then in 1948, Congress restored approximately 500,000 acres to the reservation, an area referred to as the southern extension, Hill Creek. That brought the acreage up to 1.3 million acres, which is the current acreage to this day. It's changed a little bit since then, but the illustration shows you that the boundaries, let's say in total 4.5 million acres originally, the 2 combined reservations, and out of the 4.5 million acres, a little over 1 million acres currently exists. Okay? So land that was designated for the Utes continued to be taken away. Okay. The Utes have suffered their own trail of tears and remorse. They were removed from their homelands in western Colorado as well as central Utah. They were not allowed to hunt off the reservation. Over time, they were stripped of their lifeways, especially the horse culture, which died along with the language and traditional cultural practices. They suffered a decline in moral standards with alcoholism, broken homes, and other forms of dysfunction. Why tell the story? Why retell it? Well, trauma affects the conqueror as well as the conqueror. Conquered. Because the truth leads to reconciliation. I didn't say that very well. I hope you got it. But the truth is what's important, okay? What you do with it is up to you. We're running out of time, but that's the story I'm trying to say to you. The coming age will be a spiritual age, a time when science and the sacred will recognize a common origin and destination. They will be seen as 2 sides of the same coin of creation. We will discover just how connected consciousness is to our universe. We will find an awareness at the center of it all, one that has been waiting for us for a very long time. Reverend Stephen Charleston, he's a Choctaw Indian who was a bishop in the Episcopal Church. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on this. Trauma began to be studied as a result of the effects of the Holocaust on the Jewish people. And so they discovered that some of the effects of the trauma were evident in indigenous people as well as other people, African American people as well. And trauma is an injury, a hurt, and damage caused by a deeply disturbing experience. It can be physical, emotional, or spiritual. It may have lasting impacts. Now, the one who said that trauma can exist in the conqueror as well as the conquered was R. Menakem. He wrote the book, My Grandfather's Hands. I urge you to read that. I think we're done. Only by healing ourselves can we begin to heal the earth. And I won't spend time with that or that. Because lately progress has become so destructive to the earth, our home. So let us come together to do the work. And this is from my friend Jane Goodall. I met her in 2001 or 2. And we've been good friends ever since. And so she, as you know, is a wonderful, she's an earth mother. She is so powerful and spiritual. I'm proud to call her my friend. She appointed me to her legacy foundation, which will carry on after she passes. And so I'm very honored to do that. So that's it. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions or not.
5 minutes for questions?
5 minutes?
5 pushing it. 4 minutes. 4 minutes for questions. If anyone has anything for Forrest.
Any burning questions you've always wanted to ask an Indian?
I do think Forrest will be sticking around, right?
I'm sorry?
Are you sticking around a little bit?
Yeah, I'll be, I think we'll be around for lunch. I'm sorry. You want to join us for lunch? Yeah. Be around for lunch.
Around for Forrest.
Thank you.